There is a silence that only snow can bring. It's not just the muting of sound, but the slowing of time itself. The way snow falls, not hurried, not hesitant, just surrendered. That's the kind of silence that opens The Snow Child, Alaska, 1920. A couple lives on the edge of survival, on the edge of a land that wants to swallow them whole. Mabel and Jack, childless. Weathered by grief, by years, by the aching kind of quiet that exists not when there is no sound, but when there is no laughter. And it's this silence that pulls you in. Because it doesn't announce itself like a storm. It arrives gently, like the breath before a sob. Mabel tried to end her life once. It was before they came to Alaska. She walked into a frozen river, wanting the cold to stop what grief had started. But even then, something stopped her. Not the fear of death, but the ache of knowing that even in leaving, there would still be pain. Jack didn't know. He doesn't know how close he came to returning home alone. But then that's the tragedy of so many relationships. How easily we stand side by side in silence, both drowning, thinking we're alone. Their days in Alaska are not romanticized. This isn't nature as therapy. It's brutal. The cold cracks their hands. The soil fights back. They're not young anymore. They've carried their sadness across states and into a place where the mountains don't care about your sorrow. And yet there is something about Alaska that mirrors what they carry. It doesn't pretend, it doesn't soften, it just is. Vast and wild and unyielding, like grief. But then one night, it snows. Thick, blanketing, forgiving snow. And for a moment, just a moment, Mabel and Jack play. They build a snow child. They carve out a little girl from snow and dress her in mittens and a red scarf. They laugh. It's a small, wild kind of laugh. The kind you forget you're capable of. They name her. And when they wake the next morning, the snow girl is gone. In her place are footprints, tiny, barefoot, leading into the trees. At first, it feels impossible. A fox-like girl glimpsed between trees, a red scarf fluttering in the distance. You question it with them. Is this grief taking shape? Madness made visible? But the girl keeps appearing, not like a ghost, like a creature, wild, quiet, watching. She calls herself Faina. She doesn't like being touched. She comes and goes with the snow, and always there is that same quiet about her, like winter itself has made her flesh. Mabel begins to hope again, not the naive hope of someone who believes things will return to what they were, but the dangerous, tender kind of hope that whispers maybe something new can grow. She reads old Russian fairy tales about snow maidens, girls made of frost who melt when loved too much. She begins to fear that love itself might undo Faina, that if they're too warm, too human, they'll lose her. Isn't that the paradox of healing? Wanting to hold something without destroying it, wanting to love without suffocating. Jack is more cautious. He suspects there's something real about Faina, that she has a background, a father, history. He sees her bloody kills, the birds, the rabbits. He sees how she survives the wilderness like she belongs to it, and he wonders, is she magic? Or is she a child so brutalized by nature that she's become part of it? Either way, both he and Mabel start to change, not because they believe in miracles, but because they're finally moved by something again. And here's where the book quietly undoes you. It doesn't tell you what Faina is, not really. It doesn't explain her. It doesn't pin her down. Because magic, in its truest form, can't be held under bright lights. It resists translation. It only exists in that quiet place where belief meets need. And Mabel and Jack, two people who had stopped needing anything, begin to need again. They begin to hope, to plant, to build, to invite neighbors, to live again, not because Faina gave them something, but because her very presence reminded them what they had buried. That's the first shift. Not the plot, the feeling, the thaw. It's slow, uneven, but it's happening. The kind of healing that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't come with closure or clarity, just a softening of the frost. And maybe that's the truth of the story. We survive grief not by resolving it, but by learning how to live beside it. The snow never stops falling, but somehow you begin to move again within it, not in defiance, in surrender, like the snow. The seasons shift slowly in Alaska. There's no dramatic calendar change, no sudden signal that things are new. The snow simply lingers less, the wind forgets to bite. And somewhere in that half space between winter and spring, Faina returns, always in winter. She's never there when the world is green, never when the sun stays too long, as if she can only survive in the hush, as if the heat would expose her. Mabel begins to write again, not for others, just for herself. Small, fragile letters to her sister back east. In them, you feel something returning to her, not confidence, not quite, but presence. That ability to sit inside a moment without needing to escape it. She's no longer only grieving what she lost. She's now slowly letting herself touch what she has. Jack, too, begins to soften. He hires a neighbor's boy, begins to share work, begins to admit that the land doesn't have to be a punishment. It can be hard and still worth planting, still worth building. And all through this thaw, Faina comes and goes like weather. She never explains, she never justifies, but she stays long enough, often enough, to grow roots in their hearts. And this is where the danger lies, because how do you hold something that refuses to be held? How do you love someone who belongs more to wind and fur and snow than to your world of rooms and stoves and speech? There's a moment when Jack follows her tracks. He needs to know. He's not driven by logic anymore. It's not about answers. It's about the ache that comes with loving something mysterious, that need to understand as a way of getting closer. But when he finds her, it's not some revelation. No hidden cabin, no secret guardians, just her, alone, surviving. He sees how thin she is, how animal-like, how capable. And still, he doesn't know what she is. A child abandoned, a child invented, a child made of longing and myth and survival. And yet it doesn't matter, because she's real enough to wound, real enough to save, real enough that their love for her begins to shape the way they see the world. That's the strange power of connection. It makes everything else shift around it. They begin to live as if she's part of their world, even if she keeps stepping in and out of it. But love is never without consequence. As Mabel and Jack begin to anchor themselves to Faina, the fear of loss sharpens. Mabel dreams of melting. As she reads more of the Snow Maiden tale, in it, the girl dies when she falls in love, when she gets too close to warmth. Mabel starts to believe that her love is dangerous, that her affection might destroy Faina. Isn't that how grief rewires the heart? It tells you that joy is a trap, that closeness leads to vanishing. So you hold back, you smile softly, you don't reach too far. You love cautiously, afraid that too much might make it all disappear. Then Faina brings someone into their lives. Garrett, the neighbor boy who once helped Jack. He's grown now, restless, curious, and unlike Jack and Mabel, he's not content to love Faina from afar. He wants to know her, touch her, speak to her, name her, and in that desire, something shifts again. Faina isn't just a child now, she's growing, she's becoming a young woman. And with it comes a new quiet terror that the story might be repeating, that what happened in the old tale, the Snow Maiden melting under the weight of love, might unfold again, not as magic, as metaphor. But what can you do when someone begins to love? You can't stop it. You can't edit it. You can only watch and hope the world is kinder this time. And maybe that's what maturity is on their net, not the hardening, but the softening, the surrender to things that might break you again. Jack and Mabel begin to accept that Faina isn't theirs. She never was. You don't own snow, you don't own wildness, you just get to witness it if you're lucky, and love it while it's near. That realization doesn't come with peace, it comes with a quiet ache, but also with clarity. They begin to understand that what they were given wasn't a second chance at parenting, it was a second chance at living. The snow falls again, the land goes quiet, Faina disappears for longer stretches now. She no longer arrives with every flurry, she's chasing something else, or maybe letting herself be chased. But here's the truth. Faina's presence gave Jack and Mabel something they didn't even know they needed. Not just hope, but tenderness. Not just wonder, but the courage to begin again, to dig, to plant. to open the door when neighbors knock. Her coming crack them open, her leaving reshapes them again. And as the story drifts toward its inevitable close, you begin to feel the weight of all things that are beautiful because they are brief, because they cannot be held, because they vanish just as you learn how to love them, right? There's a different kind of silence that settles when someone hasn't returned. It's not the crisp hush of snowfall or the peaceful quiet of an early morning. It's heavier. The kind of silence that presses against the chest, demanding to be acknowledged. That's the space Jack and Mabel now live in. The snow comes, but Fina does not. The footprints they once traced from the forest's edge are gone. The girl of frost and wind and longing has vanished into the very thing that birthed her. And with her absence comes a question neither of them can ask aloud. What if that was all she was ever meant to be? A passing thing, a flake that never stays? But time doesn't stop even in grief. Jack continues to work the land. Mabel bakes. They no longer live as ghosts in their own home. Because Fina, in disappearing, left more than memories. She left movement. She woke the house up, she made it lived in again, and even when her presence begins to feel like a dream, something half remembered in the dawn, the love remains. That's the strange grace of enchantment. Even when it dissolves, it stains the soul, and then she returns. Not with snow, not with flurries, not as a girl, but as a woman. Leaner, stronger, still wild-eyed, still unreadable, and not alone. With her is Garrett, and suddenly the story shifts again, not back to the beginning, but forward towards something neither Mabel nor Jack imagined possible. A life that continues beyond the magic. A future that isn't built in defiance of sorrow, but beside it. Fina is pregnant. It's the kind of news that should bring joy, but instead it brings an unease that coils through Mabel's chest. Because how do you mother the unknowable? How do you guide someone who has always fled from warmth? Jack is more grounded. He sees the practical needs: shelter, food, hands to help. He welcomes Garrett, offers him land, helps him build. But Mabel's holding her breath, and maybe it's because she knows, deep down, that winter doesn't last forever. That snow, and no matter how much you love it, melts. Fina was never meant to stay. Not really, but this child, it might be a different kind of a legacy. Not one made of frost and vanishing, but of breath and skin and permanence. The idea terrifies Mabel, not because she fears the child, but because she fears what it will cost. When the birth comes, it's in a storm. Of course it is. The wind howls as if mourning. The snow falls sideways. Jack and Mabel are there, guiding, holding, praying. And when the child is born, a girl, fragile and furious, Fina disappears again into the snow, alone. She doesn't return. Not that winter, not the next. Years pass. The child grows. Her name is Hazel. She is nothing like her mother and everything like her. She laughs easily, plays in the woods, collects feathers and rocks. She asks questions. She stays. And Mabel, now older, quieter, sometimes sits by the window and wonders if it really happened. If there ever was a girl who wore a red scarf and walked barefoot through snow. If they ever built a snow child who smiled back. If grief truly brought forth a miracle, or if miracles are simply what we call the things we can't explain, but feel down to our marrow. That's the brilliance of the snow child. It never confirms, it never defines. It leaves the magic intact by refusing to dissect it. And in doing so, it honors the truth that the things which change us most don't need to be provable. They just need to be real enough to soften us. Fina's legacy isn't in her name. It's in the thoughts she brought. In the garden, Jack tends. In the letters, Mabel now writes freely. In Hazel, who grows up not with silence, but with stories. And maybe that's the real magic, not that a girl made of snow came to life, but that a couple nearly dead inside came back to it. And the story doesn't end with a grand revelation. It ends as it began, in snow, in the quiet, in the open space where love and loss live side by side. No closure, just a kind of peace that isn't about answers, but about endurance. You don't need to understand the storm to survive it. You just need to let yourself be moved by it. Some stories don't end, they fade, like snow on the ground, not all at once, but slowly, subtly, until you don't remember the exact moment it disappeared. Only that it was there, that it changed the shape of everything it touched. The Snow Child ends like that, with absence that doesn't feel empty, with love that no longer demands presence to exist, with grief that no longer cuts, but aches in a way that keeps you gentle. Hazel grows up on the land her parents carved from wilderness. She becomes the kind of child who knows the call of birds, the taste of winter air, the weight of silence. She doesn't fear solitude. She doesn't chase comfort. She is not like the children Mabel once envied, noisy and ordinary. And yet, she is not like Faina either. She is rooted. She stays. There's something in her that belongs to both worlds, the feral and the familiar. Jack and Mabel grow old beside her, not clinging, but watching, grateful, weary. Their days no longer stretch with the emptiness they once held. There is now routine, and in it, a kind of holiness. The chopping of wood, the boiling of broth, the listening, the stories, because that's what they do now. They tell stories, not to entertain, to remember, to hold. Sometimes Hazel asks about her mother. Mabel doesn't have easy answers. She tells what she can, that Faina loved the cold and the wind and the animals, that she was not like other people, that she belonged to the winter in a way no one else ever could. She doesn't say what. She suspects that Faina was made of something the world doesn't make anymore, that she was an answer to a grief so profound, only magic could speak to it. And even that magic was not permanent. But perhaps it wasn't meant to be. Perhaps the most sacred things are those which visit only briefly, long enough to leave an imprint, to tilt a life, not long enough to become mundane. Maybe that's why people used to believe in snow maidens and forest spirits and woodland miracles. Not because they didn't understand nature, but because they did, because they knew how temporary beauty is, how fragile wonder is, how love too can vanish in the morning sun. Jack dies first, quietly, like a man who had been carrying the weight of silence for too long and finally decided to set it down. Mabel stays on, alone again, but not the same kind of alone, not empty, not lost. She tends the land, tells Hazel bedtime stories, keeps the red scarf tucked in a drawer, not as proof, as memory. And as the final snow falls, one late season, late in Mabel's life, late in the world's turning, she swears she sees a girl standing at the edge of the trees, pale, barefoot, unmoved by time, watching, not beckoning, just being, like always. And just like that, the story closes, not with answers, with presence. With a haunting, not the scary kind, the holy kind, the kind that says, I was here, I mattered, and so did you. You could read this, The Snow Child as a fairy tale. You could read it as a psychological unraveling. You could call it magical realism or allegory or trauma fiction. But all of that would miss the point. It is what it is, like winter, like grief, like love, unnamed, but felt. It's the kind of book that doesn't ask to be understood. It asks to be felt. It invites you to remember what it's like to want something so badly that you dream it into the snow and to live with what follows. It teaches that maybe not all love is meant to be held. Still, some love, like Faina, only comes in seasons. Some healing only arrives when the ground is frozen and the world is silent and there's nothing left to do but believe. And in that space, the quiet, cold, aching space, something is born. There's a moment in quiet and easily missed where Mabel realizes that she no longer needs to ask where Faina came from. She no longer combs the woods with her eyes, no longer holds her breath at the first snowfall, waiting for a shape to appear between the trees. The ache never left, but the questions did, because some losses don't close like doors. They stay slightly ajar, and you learn to live beside them. You learn to leave them alone, not out of forgetting, but out of, reverence. That's the power of this story. It doesn't offer a resolution. It offers reverence. For mystery, for longing, for the wild parts of ourselves, we're told to silence. The Snow Child is not just about a girl made of winter. It's about the parts of us that are shaped by solitude, the seasons inside us, the quiet kind of joy that doesn't erase pain, but lives beside it without conflict. It's not a story of rescue. It's a story of return, of thaw, for those of us who have loved and lost, not just people, but dreams, years, versions of ourselves. This story is a mirror, not a cruel one, a soft one that doesn't demand we fix our reflections, just that we see them clearly. Faina comes into Mabel and Jack's life not to fill the hole their childlessness left, but to teach them how to stop living as though they had died with their grief. She doesn't heal them by staying. She heals them by reminding them they are still capable of love and still brave enough to lose again. And what a gift that is. When I first read this book, I didn't expect to be changed. I didn't think a story so delicate, so quiet, would shift something tectonic in me, but it did, because grief is not always loud. Sometimes it is snow on a rooftop. It is a forgotten drawer with a child's scarf. It is the way your hands still reach for someone who isn't there. And healing? Healing is not always a return to who you were. Sometimes it's becoming someone softer, someone who plants things again, someone who laughs without needing a reason, someone who, when the snow falls, no longer waits for it to disappear. And this story stays. It lingers the way winter lingers in your bones. Not painful, just present. It reminds me that not every miracle is loud. Some miracles don't arrive in thunder. They arrive barefoot with a red scarf through trees you didn't know how to enter. They don't give you answers. They give you yourself. And isn't that what enchantment really is? Not escape, not delusion, but returning to a version of you who still feels wonder, who still believes in what can't be named, who still builds snow children, not to replace what's lost, but to remind yourself that love, even in a frozen place, still knows how to rise. The Snow Child does not try to convince you of anything. It simply holds its hand out and says, "Walk with me a while." I don't promise answers, but I promise beauty, and maybe, if we're lucky, a thaw. And somehow, that's enough.